Imagine seeing a stranger's face melt away, revealing a demon underneath. That was the day my family's dark secret became my horrifying reality, and the Faceless Man came for me. I remember the first time I saw the man, the thing with the face like melting wax. I knew he had many masks and many names. He had followed our family for years, and from father to son, mother to daughter, the fear and terror of the Faceless Man got passed down. Every time he came, he would have a different face. The first time I saw him, he looked like a withered old Asian man, leaning heavily on a wooden cane with a silver top. Our front door stood wide open, and I saw my mother and father standing there, their faces as pale as ghosts as they looked down upon the stranger. I couldn't have been older than 11 years old, but the memory is still as sharp as a butcher's knife stuck into my brain. I walked forwards from the living room, the cartoon noises still blaring loudly in the background. The man looked past them and straight at me. He squinted his eyes and grinned. "Another lamb, so pretty and young," he mused. "Isn't it a shame when a child is taken so early in life? And yet God kills children every day. I heard last month, a hurricane blew an entire school down and killed 100 of the little bastards in one swift go. So perhaps God will forgive me for my small sins, my taking of a few here and there to keep my appetite satiated." "Get out of here," my father snarled through gritted teeth. He clenched his fists until the knuckles turned white, looking as if he would strike out at any moment. "Do you know who I am?" the Faceless Man asked in a whispery voice. Then he began chuckling. It sounded like someone trying to laugh with a slit throat, a harsh, gurgling sound that raised goosebumps all up and down my body. My father slammed the door shut quickly, locking the deadbolts. I fingered the silver cross my mother had given me nervously. I always did when I was anxious. Feeling it laying there cold against my skin helped bring me back to the moment. My father turned to look at us with panic-stricken eyes. I heard light knocking on the door behind him as the demonic laughter continued to grow louder, until it became all I could hear. Then, without warning, it cut off. When I looked out the peephole on the front door, I saw the front stoop stood empty. "Get my gun," my father said to my mother. She left the room, quietly sobbing as she went. Sunlight from the warm summer sky continued to stream in through the windows. What a beautiful day, I thought to myself. Such a beautiful day, and maybe my last. Then I saw a shadow cross in front of the living room window. I saw someone peeking in with wide, excited eyes, a grin like a skull spread across his leathered old face. As I watched, the face began to drip and contort as it continued to smile. It started slowly around the lips and eyes, and then it began speeding up. Within seconds, I saw the flesh running down his cheeks and chin in rivulets, dripping like flesh-colored wax. Behind the mask he wore, I caught a glimpse of something horrible before new streams of flesh rolled over it from his scalp and forehead. Then the last of the human skin dripped off, and I found myself staring into the face of hell. I could never explain the true horror of the thing lurking behind its costume of human skin. It felt like staring into a pus-filled wound with maggots writhing around the edges, or maybe like falling into a mass grave. Some of its body seemed flipped inside out, with the glistening muscles on the outside. But the bloody, demonic face was far more disturbing. It had eyes like two smoldering cigarette burns. Its mouth was a slashed, disgusting thing. The lips looked eaten away, with ragged patches of flesh surrounding them that seemed to make the smile seem much larger, reminding me of how a clown would do his makeup. I saw that grinning mouth filled with countless needle-sharp teeth above black, sore-ridden gums that writhed and shivered in its lipless mouth. Even through the window, a smell like sulfur and reeking spoiled meat filtered into the house, seeming to fill the air like a physical presence. Its body looked flipped inside out. I could see the quivering muscles on the skinless figure. It looked deathly thin, and veins ran along the outside of its face and body like thick, dark worms, pulsating with each beat of the satanic heart that lay inside that thing's chest, emanating sickness and evil through every pore of its gleaming body. As it stared into my soul with its black, lidless eyes, I saw in that face all the worst nightmares of the universe. I saw mountains of corpses festering under a hot sun, black holes eating worlds as masses screamed. I saw mothers drowning their children in bathtubs and animals eating each other alive. I saw into eternity, and it looked so dark and empty that I fell to my knees, pleading. "Make it stop! Make it stop!" I cried, tears streaming down my face. My father ran in with his shotgun raised, but when I looked back up, the window was empty. Yet the visions continued to run through my mind like a movie, atrocity after atrocity, and somehow it all connected back to the Faceless Man. After a few seconds of utter silence, that deep, gurgling voice rang out, making us all jump. It seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, reverberating throughout the room. It said something that made my father waver on his feet. A strange verse, but one I remember by heart to this day. Here is Belladonna, the Lady of the Rocks, the Lady of Situations. Here is the man with 3 staves, and here the wheel, and here is the one-eyed merchant. And this card, which is blank, is something he carries on his back, which I am forbidden to see. I do not find the hanged man. After that, we barricaded the doors and locked all the windows. I knew it wouldn't keep the Faceless Man out. He could easily just smash through a window, and perhaps he wouldn't even need to do that. Maybe he could pass inside the house anytime he wanted. And yet, if so, why hadn't he? So it started again, my mother said, looking at my father with a powerful intensity in her eyes. He has come back again for a sacrifice. My father nodded slowly. What do you mean, a sacrifice? I asked, my child's mind not comprehending the magnitude of the situation yet. My father hesitated. He eats the souls of people, my father said. He and my great-grandfather drew up a contract a long, long time ago, and ever since our family has had great wealth. You're young, so you don't really understand fully yet, but not everyone lives in mansions like us. Not everyone vacations in Paris and Buenos Aires during summer vacation. Not everyone has a garage full of Porsches and Mercedes. So why don't you just tell him no? I asked in my childish way. We don't need all this money. The left side of my father's face began twitching. He stomped towards me, shouting as tears ran down his face. I don't give a shit about money, he cried. The deal was drawn in blood and cursed from the first day. Do you think if I could get him to go away by giving him everything I own, I wouldn't? I would do it in a heartbeat. I would live in a goddamn trailer and eat instant noodles if I had to. But there is no escape. He looked around, as if expecting to see the Faceless Man standing right behind him. He began looking out of the windows, seeing nothing but a bright summer's day. We need to go, my mother whispered. Now. Let's just take Susan and go. He won't find us if we keep moving. He'll find us, my father said, looking defeated. Tears continued to stream down his face. He looked like a defeated man. He always does. But fuck it. Let's go. We'll take the bastard on a run around the world. We took off from the property, and my father told me more about the deal as we flew out of town in an expensive Mercedes, redlining the accelerator. I thought more than once he would crash and kill us all in his frenzy to put distance between us and the Faceless Man. Once every 50 years, my father said, he comes. He has his pick of the litter, as he calls it. He takes one child from our family, and in exchange, our wealth is guaranteed for the next 50 years. Even during the Great Depression, our family didn't suffer. Except, of course, the periodic abductions of children. He makes the parents watch as he takes the soul of the child into himself. I don't know what kind of foul magic it involves, but from what I've read in the diaries of my grandfather, it is a very painful ritual that involves skinning the child alive and rubbing their body with special herbs. Then he makes them walk, totally skinned and bleeding to death, until they collapse, and that's when he takes the soul. He sucks it out of their eyes. It looks like thin wisps of light when it finally goes. I shook inwardly in horror. No one would ever allow that to happen to their kid, I said confidently. My father shook his head. You act as if we have a choice, he said. The first time, he comes politely, knocks on the door, and tells the parents it is time to fulfill the contract. If they say no, then he leaves. But he always comes back, and the next time, he won't be polite, and he won't leave. He'll come into the house when we're sleeping, torture me and your mother to death, slit our throats, and then take you anyway. He's tireless. He doesn't age. He doesn't sleep. And as far as I know, he can't die. How can we fight against such an evil? By going to the moon. But why would Great-Grandpa make a deal like that anyway? I asked. Because at the time he had 10 children and all of them were starving. A few had dysentery and he didn't have a penny to his name at the time. He chose to sacrifice one and give it to the Faceless Man to save the other 9. My father shrugged. I don't know if we can understand it. I certainly don't agree with it. I'm not sure he realized at the time that our family would suffer eternally afterwards, and that the contract could not be voided except through death. He laughed bitterly. We should have just let our family line die out, maybe. That would have solved the problem. What about those words at the end, Daddy? I asked. What did those mean? Oh, that's just an old famous poem. My grandfather used to recite it to me before he shot himself. He loved T.S. Eliot, and he thought that poem had some relevance to our problems for some reason. He never got over the loss of his son to the Faceless Man, you see. Never. He used to wake up screaming in the night. He tried to drink his memories away, but in the end... My father braked suddenly, bringing the car to a full stop. I looked up, seeing forests on both sides of us. We hadn't traveled long. A hitchhiker stood at the edge of the road in grimy blue jeans and a bright tie-dye shirt. His long hair rippled around him as he stood with his thumb out, but his face had started to drip and melt. We all saw it and froze. My father reached down below his seat and pulled out the black shotgun. He ran out of the car like a madman, his eyes blazing with anger and terror. "Get out of here!" he cried as if to a rabid animal. Then he raised the gun and fired. The Faceless Man's tie-dye shirt burst into shreds as buckshot tore into it. The Faceless Man smiled, raised his hand to us in a wave, and disappeared. The clothes fell limply to the grass below, now totally empty. My father shook his head grimly and turned around to come back to the car. A dark shape zoomed out of the forest, holding a sharp knife. Before my father could turn, he raised it to his throat and pulled. My mother screamed, getting out of the car to go help my father. But he was dead. Even as a child, I knew it. I could see the knife had practically severed his head from his body, except for the spine and a thin bit of flesh on the back. Blood poured out, flooding down his chest as he stood there for a moment, uncomprehending. Then he began to fall forwards, and his head snapped back, revealing the gore, muscles, and ligaments beneath. I watched as my mother ran to his side, panic-stricken. The Faceless Man looked on with glee, laughing and shrieking. His black eyes blazed with an inner light as he looked towards me and grinned, showing the 100 needle-sharp teeth behind that suppurating sore of a mouth. My mother looked up at him, trying to grab the gun from my father's stiff hands. But the Faceless Man didn't even flinch. He ran forwards, his sleek, bloody body as fast as a greyhound's. He opened his mouth wide and bit at my mother's face. I saw the teeth bite into her skin, and he began to shake his head like a dog, ripping and shredding. Her face became a mask of gore, and I screamed in the car, nearly throwing up. But something inside told me I needed to move. I wasn't a stupid kid after all. I wasn't going to die here next to some woods in the middle of nowhere. I ran out of the back seat and jumped into the driver's seat. I had never driven a car, but it was, after all, an automatic. It didn't take much intelligence to put it in drive and hit the gas pedal. Of course, I didn't really know how to drive, and I nearly hit a tree. I skidded, turning the wheel, and with 2 bumps, I accidentally ran over my mother and father. The Faceless Man shrieked with laughter as I drove off down the road, crying and screaming in the car. I abandoned it a few hours later in the city. My father had brought a massive envelope of cash with him in the center console, and I counted it with awe. It was hundreds of thousands of dollars. I went on the run soon after, moving across the country and living on the money I found. It was 4 years later when I went to a carnival, bored, and decided to have my future read. I hadn't seen the Faceless Man in years, and I figured I'd lost him. If only that were true. The old woman pulled out her tarot card deck and began flipping them over one by one. She said in a voice that seemed to deepen. I see. Here is the man with 3 staves, and here the wheel, and here is the one-eyed merchant. I screamed, backing up quickly as the flesh began to drip off her face. And this card, which is blank, is something he carries on his back, which I am forbidden to see. The last of the skin dripped off. The grinning thing beneath rose from the chair, its sleek, bloody body and black holes of eyes regarding me with glee. Yes, I am forbidden to see, but I have seen it. I've seen it, and look what it's done to me, Susan. Look at what it's done. Your mother and father rot in a shallow grave somewhere, picked clean by animals, and now it's just you and me, Susan, and we're alone. The card is blank, but it doesn't have to be. Come and see what it holds. He rose into the air, his bloody skeletal feet dangling feet above the ground. Come and see. I pulled the pistol I always carried out of its holster and began firing at point-blank range into the demonic face and black heart of that thing. People began to scream all around me at the carnival. I turned to run out of the tent, but a cold hand gripped my shoulder. Leaving so soon? The soft voice whispered in my ear, laughing with a sound a drowning man might make. But we haven't finished, Susan. Worthy is the lamb. Worthy is the lamb. Worthy is the... Suddenly, the hand touched the silver cross my mother had given me as a small girl, and it flinched away. I felt the grip loosen, and I ran without looking back. People had taken cover all over the carnival. Many had started to leave, and I saw agitated police and security trying to find out where the gunshots had come from. I immediately mixed into a large crowd and made my way towards the exit. But I constantly looked back, expecting to see a man with a melting face. Perhaps it would act like a police officer and pretend to arrest me before bringing me to some dark forest and starting the skinning process. I keep running now, but I always look over my shoulder. Because the Faceless Man doesn't age, and he doesn't sleep, and he never, ever stops looking.